My guest today is Aria Babu. She is a writer, a pronatalist interested data researcher, and someone who's really dug into the data of why aren't people having children and why is it important and maybe what we can do or not do about it. So that's essentially the subject of our conversation today. It's all here. If you'd like to support my work, watch, listen to the whole backlog of conversations I've had and read my writing, please do go to alexkashuta.com and become a member of my Substack, or go to patreon.com/aka Subversive to listen to the audio of the podcasts from the beginning of history on to today. Thank you so much for your support and enjoy the conversation. So your work has focused quite a lot on prenatalism, on birth rates, declining birth rates. I think maybe to set the context a little bit, why is it so important to focus on this? This is kind of a new theme that's kind of emerged in public consciousness. And just in the last few years, up until very recently, people were very concerned, and people still are, a lot of them, especially on the left, concerned with overpopulation, dwindling resources, and things like that. Why do you think the tack has shifted a little bit, and kind of what's driving these worries? Should we be worried? What about should we be worried?
So for one, I actually don't think it's a super new concern. So before the baby boom, we also had like sub replacement birth rates, and people were worried then as well. Um, you got lots of like French posters because like France had a lower France's birth rate like dropped for everyone else, where they're like, oh my god, France is over, we have to be breeding for France. And then the baby boom happens, and people are relaxed again because like basically most countries are at replacement level, and now we're like back below replacement level, and people start to be worried again. I think part of the reason it took like longer, we didn't start to panic when we were at 1.8. We were like started to panic when we were like at 1.5. This is the UK context. Um, because like we like assumed that we could rely on immigration, but we even hit like global peak births probably in 2014. So now people are also getting anxious about our abilities to rely on immigration as well. So I don't think it's a new panic. I think it's just a panic that goes like up and down with how important it is at any given point.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and especially with the kind of, it feels very steep, so very precipitous, the decline, and I think it also kind of plays into a lot of narrative. So, I wonder what you make between, like, what do you think the difference is between the public perception of these trends and kind of how that factors into, like, culture wars things. A lot of people have their own interpretation of why this is happening. It's very like on the right, especially. This is kind of where the conversations are happening typically. It's very much about kind of feminism, female empowerment, women, kind of leading the charge. But it does seem to me like it's on the male side as well. Like the average man in Western countries is also not itching to procreate in a massive fashion as they were in eras before. So how do you see this narrative kind of contrast with what you see in the data? Like where is the birth decline coming from?
Ooh, that's lots of questions in one.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll start with like what do I think of the narrative? When I first got interested in this, like several years ago, it was like quite fringe and it was quite right wing. Um, I think because like people had like the instinctive like response that like, well, we can just have more immigration. I think like the idea that the economy was stagnating wasn't quite so prescient in like the British context either. So people were like, well, it'll probably be okay. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to have like some immigration maybe, but like Britain isn't dead. Um, and but like in the past, let's say like year or so, I've noticed that like mainstream publications have been talking about this like it is a problem. Like The Economist will write about it, the FT will plausibly write about it, serious academics are talking about it. And I think more normal people are now infusing it into the way they talk about the British like problems. So you will see people talking about the fact that we have an aging population, the fact that the birth rate is low as like a package of, and like the fact that our productivity growth is low in a package of topics about why the UK is stagnating.
Yeah, I mean it does seem like a problem that's kind of constrained to a certain time period. So essentially the main worry is, okay, aging population, who's going to pay our pensions, who's going to wipe the bums, essentially. But then obviously if birth rates stabilize, and they historically have tended to stabilize at a certain level, it the effect will dampen after kind of the cycle, after the generations have to kind of bear the brunt of the diminishing resources for them. Then we're kind of going to reach a more stable point. Do you see this as a potential, because people are talking about, South Korea is going extinct, things like that. Do you see that that's a potential worry, or is, do you see some point of stabilization in the future?
Um, so I think I see some point of stabilization in the future, but this is a slightly darker prediction. Whereas I think it is most likely that if nothing changes, if we don't have a sort of mainstream like prenatal culture revival, what we'll see is several cultures going extinct. South Korea being like a really good example of one. Italy, like a whole bunch of like fantastic cultures. I mean, I guess in the long run, even just sort of like mainstream, like liberal, like Western, like Anglo culture as well, even though our birth rates are healthier than like, South Korea's or Italy's. Um, and those cultures will be replaced by like the highly fertile cultures, which are like we're talking the Amish, Orthodox Jews, etc. If nothing changes, obviously, like it's quite strange to look at like 300 years of humanity or whatever it is that we're talking about these timescales and say, well, nothing's going to change. Things will change, but I think we should be worried about where the trend is headed.
Yeah, I think the worry about birth rates going to zero, I think that's a bit of a point. I can imagine, there's going to be a point of stabilization, but it's like you said, it's very hard to predict what that will be. Will it be, above one, below one? It's definitely involves quite a lot of reduction in population. But in terms of the causes, obviously there could be many causes. People could just describe it as modernity, which is not necessarily a explanatory format. Essentially just says what is happening now, well, which doesn't really tell you much, because yeah, I don't think many people would want to nix modernity and return to pre-modernity just for to fix the birth rate. So within modernity, what do you think? What do you see in the data seem to be kind of the driving factors? Like where exactly is this birth decline coming from?
I think part of the reason we don't have like a set answer on this is I think there are several problems all grouped in together that look like one problem, which is why we don't have like a solid like theory that is like this is why birth rates decline. And some people like to reach for their classic like political crutches, so they'll be like, it's because people are poor, it's because we don't redistribute money enough, and some people be like it's because we're not trad enough. But I don't think that like fully explains what's happening. I would say you can kind of group it into four problems which feel basically like they're separately caused, but come together to decrease birth rates, which is the decline of relationships, the decline of relationships turning into marriage, the number of people who get married and then take a long time to have their first child, and then people who are having fewer children than they historically would have. And I think all of those problems, they're obviously like interlinked, but they feel like a little bit distinct. I don't have like a good answer to why relationships declining. The first one. I often see people like point to like dating apps or something like that, or maybe the internet. People, teenagers are on their phones too much, neuroticism. But I couldn't tell you like why I think like that's definitely happening. And the decline of marriage is also a little bit confusing to me. It seems to be declining much more amongst working class people than it is amongst middle class people. But middle class people are still delaying marriage. I was talking to a Finnish demographer recently who says that in Finland, what seems to be happening is young people are cohabitating at very similar rates to how they used to. But instead of that cohabitation moving on to marriage or children, um, those cohabitations were dissolving at around the time people in their late 20s, when historically like late 20s cohabitations like would have been like that would have been your main relationship. So people are delaying the rate at which they're forming their like proper relationship, because after you like move from a cohabitation, you then got to like move back home, you've got to like recover from what was clearly quite a serious relationship, you've got to date again. So that usually adds like 3 or 4 years onto a timeline that, if you want to have lots of kids, really should be happening younger. And then I think maybe like the hesitation of moving from like 0 to 1 child, or like 1 to 2 to 3 or something, those might be like quite related. And I think that is probably largely coming from increased burden of parenting. So parents are spending a lot more time with their children. In fact, France, which is like the European country with the healthiest birth rate, French parents spend the least amount of time with their children. They have, I think, what in Britain we would consider to be like quite awful nurseries where they have like loads of kids like per adult, and not very much pastoral care, as you would say. Like French parents seem like basically negligent, and I think that helps them to have more children. Um, and I think you see a good example of this is that the countries with the lowest birth rates also seem to have the most homework. So I think there's like a prediction about like how much investment you're going to have to make per child, and oh, if I have a second child, then um, I'm not going to be able to like dedicate all the attention I have to my first child, and then they're not going to get into a good university, and they're not going to achieve very much in life. So I think that is what's happening at the end, where like people are only choosing to have like one child, or they're choosing to delay when they have their first child so that they're more resource rich. So I think it's like a complicated, multifaceted problem, which is why it's very difficult to say this is definitely what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is an interesting quirk to a lot of kind of the more right-wing, trad adjacent, conversation, aesthetics, and all of that. Very much kind of the, mother stays at home, is focused on the child, homeschooling. Like the kind of idealized version of the family is one where there's quite a lot of investment in the child from the mother. There's a lot of kind of this, crunchy mom culture built into child rearing. There's also kind of the work of people like Erica Commissar, which is very much, praised on the right wing about, if you send children to daycare, I don't know, something horrible happens.
Yeah, their attachment styles are like permanently ruined, I think is her case. Yeah.
Yeah, I to be honest, like I think that work, like a lot of social science work that is, praised by the left or the right in this case, suffers from the same issue of, selection effects that even on the right people don't really like to address if they confirm their biases, which is that, mothers should not put their babies down, or the world will come and corrupt them by dissolving their attachment styles, or doing some malign intervention on their psyche from outside the family. So I think this, the idea that you kind of have to ring fence the family, and the family is this kind of independent unit from society. I understand why that's really appealing to the right wing, but it involves this high intensity parenting, because a lot of people on the right wing, it's not like they keep their children at home and then they raise them like they did in like the 16th century. No, they're people who are plugged into parenting discourse. They're concerned about proper feeding, screen time, all of these things, playing with their children, all of this stuff. I mean, I'm a mom to two young children. I'm very much plugged into what I'm supposed to be doing, because that's just the water we swim in. But it really does feel like I don't imagine how I would add another child to the combination at the moment. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and with the level of intensity of parenting that we're doing now, and the support systems that we have, and kind of the ambient culture that we live in. I live in Romania, which is not like some sort of super liberal place, but yeah, people's parenting intensity is quite serious. Like after school activities, taking baby to baby and mommy classes, all of this stuff. It's part of the culture. So I could just say no. I'm just gonna plop them in front of the TV. But as I was raised, to be honest, but it's I can't do that because I'm a modern gentle parent. So we have to do the whole spiel with them. But yeah, I
Well,
feel
with
like
normal birth spacing, um, your like 3-year-old, I expect, will be like 5 or 6 by the time you have your next child anyway. So probably there'll be much less work then. I don't know.
I hope so. That's my dream. It's really interesting to me. It really does matter what the personality of the child is. Like my firstborn really is kind of like a high intensity child who kind of demands a certain style of high intensity parenting. Like he's just essentially that's kind of his approach to life. He's constantly in danger. He's constantly doing something that needs supervision. While my younger son, like the baby, he just like he plays independently. He doesn't really, he does some naughty stuff, but then if you tell him no, he looks at you and then he stops, which is an effect that I did not expect any child to be able to do, because I only had the experience with my first, for whom no is just kind of a dare. It's like, no, 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 please. I encourage you to kill yourself. So it is really interesting. But yeah, I think like you said, with normal birth spacing and hedging with child's personality, it should be doable if you have access to a certain amount of support. And I think a lot of people are missing that. I mean, do you see anything in the data about this? Like, does the availability of childcare, does our grandparents closer to the home, things like that, does that affect birth rates in any way?
So I tried to look into this on an inter-country level, and it does seem that the provision of state childcare doesn't really have any effect on birth rates. You get like really interesting examples where you have like Switzerland and Austria, where like Austria's got like really cheap, like they're like kind of a socialist country, right? So they've got really cheap childcare. I think on average it costs something like I'm going to be pulling these numbers out of my brain, so they'll be a bit wrong, but like Austrian childcare costs something like 7% of the average woman's earnings, whereas like Swiss childcare costs something like 70% of the average woman's earnings. And those countries, because they've got very similar like overall like cultures, they have the same birth rate, despite the fact that like childcare is like very cheap. Obviously, that doesn't tell you what people are doing in their personal lives. Like anecdotally, London's got incredibly expensive childcare, but almost all of my friends have some combination of grandparent care or like allo parenting that they're like fudging together their childcare arrangements from. So clearly they're not all using the like sort of £30,000 like one person's entire earnings childcare that's available just sort of like openly. I would be really, really surprised if the provision of childcare doesn't have some effect. Just thinking about like how the simple accounting of having two children in like a modern country seems to be that like childcare is going to cost an entire income, basically. And I think there are very few countries where something like this isn't the case. But I cannot find like the data that makes that clear. I suspect because people are very like opaque and idiosyncratic in what their personal relationships are like. So like I, for example, was taken care of by my next door neighbor, who was also our landlady and was also my mum's best friend. That is like a difficult like data relationship to like kind of like kind of like tease out, because like I suppose most people have these like strange arrangements that basically just work for them.
Yeah, it does seem to me like and kind of the people that I know, it's here. There's a lot of grandparent involvement. Like I think the biggest contrast that I see with the West, and people that I know from like my college or work experience in London. I think also people live closer together, and there's still kind of a cultural expectation that the grandparents will be involved. I think this is also because the grandparents are of a different era, in the sense that um, you know there really weren't the expectations that old age is for anything other than taking care of your grandchildren, especially for older women. Like the idea that you're going on cruises and things like that, it's just financially, number one, pretty impossible, and it's just not within the kind of realm of imagination of people. I'm sure some people would, but it's just not given. They're very kind of itching to step in. Like I was raised for a very long time by my maternal grandmother. They just kind of shipped me off to her, and she was kind of like my second mother, and they would just kind of tag team who's taking me at what time, and it was just like my grandparents' home was just like my house, and which I think is a bit of a kind of an exotic arrangement for a lot of people in the West nowadays. It just doesn't seem like the default. Like here, that's still the default. Like we have a pair of friends which we're very kind of jealous of sometimes that also have two kids, but they're always on vacation alone. I'm like, what? Where are your children? They're with either set of grandparents. They live at the grandparents' house while the parents are on vacation, which seems like a nice little luxury to have. I mean, not complaining, but it's cool. So yeah, it's but like you said, it doesn't really seem to affect birth rates, because I was looking into the Romanian birth rates, and it is one of the higher ones in Europe. But I think what a lot of people don't miss about it is that Romania also has kind of this parallel society within it, which is about 8 to 9% of the population, which is kind of the Roma part. We have the largest population of Roma in Europe, and their birth rate is about 3.3, and it really drags up the Romanian birth rate. Kind of ethnic Romanians, like what I'm saying, not that this is like a completely, these people are like, but they do have essentially a very parallel society. They have their own Moors, they have their own king, they even have their own emperor. They've got like kind of a parallel legal system. They're not really that enmeshed with mainstream Romanian society, which is much more plugged into the European average. And I've actually done the math on this, because this statistic is nowhere to be found. But the adjusted by kind of ethnicity for like ethnic Romanian population is about 1.6 from 1.74, which would be kind of the
So that's basically
declared.
the same as Britain. Yeah.
Yeah, or I think it's a bit lower than Sweden, pretty much the same as Belgium. So, the difference between Eastern and Western Europe seems to be kind of diminishing if you can take into account that there are kind of ethnic enclaves here. But in a way, you have that with Amish, you have that with Jewish Orthodox, which is essentially what's happening a little bit in Israel as well, where kind of secular Jewish birth rates are about 2, which is high compared to the Western world, but is not as high as when you drag it up by people who are really Orthodox, really kind of represent a society in their own right.
Yeah, and that's going to cause Israel lots of problems because the Orthodox don't work that much. They don't serve in the army. And I guess they were given their special place in Israeli society when they were a small part of the population. But exponentials, man, you gotta take this into account. Um, and I guess like that to some extent that's where we're all headed. Um, Although I do think the secular Jewish birth rate being around 2 is like maybe an optimistic answer to what might happen because people seem to be very socially suggestible about the number of children that they're going to have. So if you move from like Japan to the USA, your birth rate will be like much more American than it will be Japanese, even though I assume you're still like, mentally like very much like part of Japanese culture. So I suspect like being like close to the Orthodox massively increases the birth rates of secular Jews because secular Jews in other countries don't have a birth rate of like 2. So I think there's like some hope where like when the highly fecund subcultures grow to be a larger part of your society, your secular birth rate will like rebound because they are like copying them and they're being socially suggested by them as well, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's actually very interesting, because this is the argument that a previous guest on the show, who goes by the name of non-Zionism, made about why the Israeli birth rate is high and why it's high even outside of the Orthodox community. That there are kind of gradations of orthodoxy, kind of like these circles, concentric circles around the Orthodox, where the kind of the Orthodox represent kind of a aspirational religious culture, but people are not really willing to make the sacrifices and the kind of investment to become that, but they're still quite religious, even though they're not counted as Orthodox and they don't consider themselves Orthodox, but they are kind of aspiring to that. And I guess, yeah, that kind of that cultural influence, like you said, it kind of seeps out of that community and acts as sort of an inspiration to people who have a religious affiliation. I guess that's probably I don't know if it. I guess this is hard to test, but would it just be aspirational to see a Orthodox family with their 9 children at the store or something, and someone who's secular would be like, yeah, I can squeeze another one in, or do you have to have kind of the aspirational religious element there, where it's like, okay, these guys are doing it right, but I just can't make the jump, but I can have one more kid.
It might just be having a friend who's Orthodox will do it. So people will have more children if one of like their like close friends has a child. Um, So you can see this as like time series data where like one friend from like a friend group will have a child, and then like 9 months later, basically when their child is born, their other friends will also start to have children. So it could just be that like these like Orthodox Jews are not like completely like socially segregated from secular Jews. Like you'll have like one that you went to uni with who's in like you know, they're a bit quirky, but they're like in your friendship group. And then when they start to have children, you're like, oh, maybe that seems quite nice. Maybe I'll do that. Just like basically the same way it seems to work in other countries too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Have you seen anything about kind of female labor force participation? Because I guess that plays into, you know, the importance of mothers. But do you see in countries where women are less of the labor force, is there more of an accent of, you know, are they breeding more, or is it kind of a wash?
So there's kind of a U shape on this actually. So countries where female labor force participation is like it's yeah, there are lots of confounders on this, but like countries where female labor force participation is like very low, um, you have like quite high birth rates, but those are largely very poor countries. And then you see it kind of like dip and then go up again. So like countries where like it is like basically like socially accepted that women will work for a bit, but that when they have young children that they won't work. So we're talking your Italy's, your Japan's, your Korea's. They're the ones with the lowest birth rates. And then countries where it's like quite normal to be a working mother, your Nordic countries, your Britons, your Frances, are then like have like correspondingly higher birth rates. I think it's because like with like if the like opportunity cost of having a child is economically really really strong because you think that you've got to give up like 4 years of work, which is 4 years of like experience, your long term earnings will be affected, but also it's like 4 years of earnings immediately, probably at a point in your career where it's like most important to be working for like getting between like different stages of like eventual success. Having a child is much more costly, and therefore like you really only want one. Or maybe you don't want one, or maybe you're going to delay to the point that you're like infertile or something. Um, so yeah, female labor force participation is related to birth rates, but probably not in the way that you think.
hmm Do you see anything special about Southern Europe? It seems like there is kind of like an extra kind of degree of separation between that little landmass in Europe and everywhere else, where birth rates really have declined, and they really seem to be going down quite steeply.
Yeah, I think so. I probably series of things. One, really poor like economic growth, which means, and I guess like very very like low youth employment. So you end up with lots of young men, especially, who do not have jobs, and they do not have jobs throughout their 20s and 30s. Maybe they by about 30s start to have jobs. And there's a culture there where if you don't have your own job and you're not independent, you still live with your parents. Um, so that means that relationship formation is like very difficult for like Italian young men. Um, yeah, so basically, like if you're not forming a relationship, you're probably not then going to get married, and you're probably not then going to have children. And on top of that, the culture like you is like very like against out of wedlock births as well. So like most countries with like a healthy birth rate um, have like quite a significant number of children born to unmarried couples. The fun stat I have on this is that Japanese and British in wedlock birth rates are the same, but then like Britain has like an extra number of like children who are born to unmarried parents. So like I guess like Catholic culture is like not permissive out of wedlock births, and the like Southern European economies are not conducive to people getting married, and so those two things mean that people aren't having like nearly as many children as probably like Italians like feel that they like really want to.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and in a way, kind of illustrates how kind of systematically socially conservative countries could kind of put the perfect as the enemy of the good in terms of birth rates. If you're concerned about sheer birth rates, in mind can be counterproductive to be too socially conservative, because you're essentially kind of trying to stigmatize and exclude a whole chunk of the population who, you know, would definitely contribute to your birth rate if they could, or if they would feel like they wouldn't be, you know, ostracized or shamed to do it.
Yeah, another version of this I think is like the problem in South Korea, where also the men are quite sexist. And so the women, like, they have like Western ideas about like how women like ought to be treated. They can watch television, they can see romances, and they see like their own country's men who seem to be like, well, actually, when you get married, you should basically be my domestic servant. And you've seen like Korean political parties largely voted for by men who are advocating for like women not getting like promotions at work and not being like that. Like the culture can be like quite oppositional between the genders. Um, and that like has to harm relationship formation. You can see data on this in the US where like political polarization between the genders is like causing like a number of women to like feel like they can't find partners because women are like twice as likely to be, I think, like Democrat voters, and therefore they like are also more likely to say that they want to be with someone who votes similarly to them. So yeah, I suspect like political polarization that is like kind of caused by a version of social conservatism seems to also be quite negative, considering like women do want their lives to be good and they don't really want to be domestic servants.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting narrative that on the one hand you kind of have this trad wife movement. A lot of women, I think for a good reason, see that there's a bit of an emptiness in just the corporate grind, and they do tend to want to become mothers. They do like the idea of staying home, of raising their children. They like the aesthetic of it as well. There's quite a lot of aesthetics kind of flowing into this. The also kind of tied into homesteading and making things at home, and these are all kind of domains that women love. It's a kind of Pinterest style motherhood. Just nesting. We love this.
Mm-hmm.
I love this. But at the same time, you kind of have a tension there, because obviously a lot of this content is not necessarily geared to women. Like I see this a lot online, because you kind of have there's kind of a gulf. There's kind of this patriarchy tied triedwifery, which is all about the service that women should provide to men and all this type of stuff. This isn't necessarily for women, but then you have kind of the aesthetics accounts, like I don't know, women cooking extravagant things in their beautiful kitchens and things like that, which do appeal to women because it's kind of the aesthetics of it. And I feel these are two kind of pretty much non-overlapping magisteria. Like I think people kind of conflate these two, and I've seen, actually, because obviously I'm a mom, I follow a lot of kind of mommy content, recipes, all this type of stuff, and I've seen a lot of women trying, women who cook at home and have children and stuff like that, trying to distance themselves from this, like videos like, oh, why I'm not a trad wife. And I think I saw 3 of these in one day. Like, okay, I don't belong to this circle. And I just wonder, why do you think this movement, whatever side of it, does it have any chance to have an impact? Will women be gravitating to these aesthetics, or is it just kind of just another internet fad?
I think it will probably appeal to people who are very wealthy, um, where like it's quite difficult to have like beautiful things and like a good life, if you don't have money. And like a lot of the like, I mean, you classically get this about ballerina moms specifically, where like her lifestyle is largely sustained by the fact that her husband's father is like a billionaire. Um, yeah, and if you are very wealthy, then I can see like there are like women probably who are married to very wealthy men who think that, instead of like pursuing a career, that like they would like to pursue like an aesthetic, idealized version of motherhood. But for most people, choosing that life, um, and forgoing a second income is basically like choosing poverty for their families. And so I suspect that like mostly it's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really astute, and I can see, like in my circle, I'm the only person that I know, not the only person, of a very few, kind of select few, that has kind of multiple children, maybe planning on having more. And it does feel like one of the big constraining factors is kind of disposable income. Like having children for us, at least at this point, having babies is not very expensive, but it hasn't really, warped our lifestyle in any way. Not that we were doing anything big, but it could, because there are lots of costs associated with it, especially if you want to keep up with the parenting Joneses, which we already said is quite, it's quite constraining in many ways. So yeah, I think that's it does seem like it's a factor. Um, I independent of if you like the aesthetics or not, And I think a lot of people, because people keep bringing up the example of, our grandparents had a lot of children, and I agree. I mean, our grandparents, did, and the conditions that they had them in were quite strict and crazy, and they were, there's this idea that there was a kind of a commitment to transcendent values beyond materialism that people didn't have today. I mean, what do you make about this kind of nostalgia about the past? Like, were people, obviously, this, I'm not sure this appears in the data, but I'm asking you to speculate on this. Were people more tied into, was this kind of transcendent dimension of child rearing more important, or were kind of material and social conditions just so different that, it was a bit of an expectation to have more children in comparison to what it is today, where, like we said, the expectation is not really there.
I think this is like a big intellectual problem to solve, because it does seem to be the case that as we get richer, we seem to want fewer children. Like that seems to be like the law of fertility, basically, like across countries, across the world. And that should be really surprising, because usually when people have more money, they want more things. I have like my top theory for this is that the value of children has gone down while the value of other things has gone up. So my reason for saying that the value of children has gone down is broader culture, and this is like maybe like a very, very like Western lens to put on it, like a very like Anglosphere lens specifically. Broader culture does not seem to like socially reinforce um like children staying part of their like home culture and their parents' culture. So like there's kind of like a sense that like once your child is 18, you can't really like tell them like anything what to do. And while like in the data, children report having like better relationships with their parents and like feeling like their parents are more their friends, I think you see like high profile in society, like more and more people who are like, I don't talk to my parents because they vote differently and Thanksgiving is like super awkward, and um content like that. Probably like basically aping like what were like genuine tensions between like baby boomer and like Gen X kids, where like it does seem to be there was like quite a big like culture clash between those like two generations. Less so I think between Gen X and millennials. Um yeah, so like overall, like the package of being a parent means that you don't get to like fulfill that like my culture is being propagated, like I am being propagated, and that like in my old age I will have this like excellent relationship with this younger person, like a tie to the future, even after I'm dead. Meanwhile, like you can earn more at work, and that like more that you can earn at work can like supply you with like much better quality like leisure than it like ever has been, than people have ever been able to before. So like insofar as I can like say there's like one overall story as to why like we have fewer children than our grandparents, that might be it. I'm not like super convinced about arguments about like contraception and stuff, because it does seem that like people in the past had discovered like alternative methods of having sexual pleasure without creating babies. And but yeah, I do think it's like puzzling. I think about, so my grandma is like probably a good example of this, where she had six children in like a two-room house, and like two of those children didn't make it to like full adulthood, and that was just like no, like like India has like sped run like economic development, like she's basically gone from like a sort of like late middle age country to like a modern country like over the course of her lifetime, um and yeah, it does seem strange to me that someone would choose to have children in such like a dangerous circumstance, and yet like basically all people did. Um, yeah, it really surprises me.
Yeah, no, I think it's the same thing here in Romania. Like I think the maybe it's slightly less fast, or at least the timeline is a little bit looser than it is in India, but not much. I think, my grandparents were kind of raised in the same conditions. It was a bit more trouble. Kind of the addition of communism really kind of
Mm.
interrupted a lot of breeding patterns and a lot of like folkways and things like that. And I think it put a damper on fertility in a way that yeah, it's before the decree, the famous Ceausescu's decree that people which said, okay, contraception, abortion are completely
Romania had
anathema.
a bachelor tax as well, right? Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, fertility was encouraged, and also a lack of fertility was penalized, and the idea was to build Romania into kind of one of the major communist power centers. There was kind of the vision of the supreme leader, Ceausescu, was, okay, that population is essentially the gold mine of a country. 1 billion Romanians was essentially kind of his ruling credo, and he did everything he could, including jailing doctors who performed abortions, making every sort of contraception illegal, and that led to a lot of situations that are kind of Romania is now famous for, like the orphanages that are filled with a lot of children that hadn't been touched, which is also kind of the source of a lot of social science data that I think Erica Commissar is also pouring into her work. It's like it wasn't really modern daycares, to be honest, and not quite. But yeah, it's just some horrific stories that people just can't imagine happened in modernity. But a lot of those children happened as a result of the decree, which is essentially what we call like the piece of legislation that just created a whole generation of children that were unwanted and in many cases just abandoned. But it did add to the birth rate, and a lot of people cite it as an effective policy to increase the birth rate. So yeah, I think it's probably one of the few legal effective policies in relatively recent time. But yeah, it's quite a barbarous one, I think, and it's kind of lives in historical memory as one.
Yeah, I think like one of the missions of people who care about this stuff is that we need to find a way to increase birth rates in a way that preserves liberal democratic norms. Otherwise, other countries are going to be doing these policies, and they're going to be able to overwhelm the rest of the world with force. I can imagine versions of yeah, I can imagine some versions of the future where some countries have quite harsh immigration controls and forced impregnation and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those issues that it's coming to the forefront. I do hope for the future of the West as well, because whatever one thinks about Western culture, it is kind of one of the only things that has lifted, be it economic resources or whatever facet of Western culture you wanna underline. It's kind of the place that had lifted us out of immense poverty, extreme limitations on personal freedoms. And if we, for whatever reason, decide that this is okay, we can just let it wither and die. I think it's going to be very hard to recreate these conditions in future. And I really do hope that um, the solution for the birth rate decline is not societal collapse, because I think no one, even the most ardent proponents of that today, is going to be happy with it.
Hmm.
Let's see. I have a few more things here. I think, yeah, actually, what you mentioned before reminds me of this article I read right before we started the chat. It's by one of my favorite Substacks called Wood from Eden, by a lady who's been on the podcast before, Tove, and she has an interesting kind of evolutionarily tinged version of essentially the argument that you gave me before, like the idea that you said, people just don't value children in the same way they did. And her argument is that she thinks it might be a situation where back in not necessarily back in the day, but for more clannish cultures, tribal cultures, it was more important for them to do things based on kin selection rather than group selection. So you essentially had societies that were very where the idea that if you have your own children and you invest in your own children and you propagate the genes of your own clan, that is the most important thing, because these are the only people that you can rely on. Then you had, societies like Western liberal societies, where you have the possibility to coordinate with a larger group of people because you don't value, clannishness, nepotism, promoting your own, things like that. And that allows you kind of all of these ways to coordinate with other people that have made, the West what it is in many ways. And these groups outcompeted the very clannish, the very kin-based groups. And that essentially is, in her opinion, maybe one of the bigger drivers of what's going on in the West, that essentially people might even be bred to be less in-group focused, because it is, on the whole, in the large scale, a better strategy than just being completely obsessed with your own children.
I guess that does make sense, actually. It doesn't like my instinct is that we haven't been part of a like broad whole nation like countries for very long, not long enough to like leave a genetic mark. That's my immediate guess, but I have no idea.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that conservatives focus on the nation and kind of elements like this because, like you say, these are relatively new fictions, and even at the national level, you're still kind of in the domain of the of group selection. You're not really activating, the someone in like two towns further away is, to me, as foreign as someone who lives in Nepal. We might have some affinity towards language, but it's not like I consider their interests that much more than someone there. So I think once you move past the tribal close family level, I think all bets are off, even if you decide to have like a fiction like Nations. And actually, what she mentions in that an article as well is the possibility of war, which I think ties more into kind of the nation as like a level of social aggregation. It's like the pressures of war for men and kind of the heroism of motherhood for women seem to be kind of a contributing factor. Like, okay, when you have the social pressure around you, around your supposed kin group, and I think that the kin group as a nation becomes relevant in situations of war when you are under attack, which is an explanation people often give for Israeli birth rates, which is kind of like a nation under attack. Like, people are more concerned, they feel more in a state of alertness to their kind of civilizational situation. So I think that's an interesting thing. I think these pressures have fallen away, like many other pressures, but um, even under communism, we had this quite well developed. The idea that women who had more than 5 children or something were heroine mothers, like not as in the drug, but as a hero mother. They were contributing to the future of the. So it was built into the mythos of the nation. Obviously, men would be heroes on the battlefield, and women would be heroes at home, contributing to the building of the nation by providing, I guess, more soldiers to the battlefield. But yeah,
More
it's
soldiers, more workers. Yeah.
more workers. Yeah.
I I hear the like sort of the argument that like because Israel's on the brink of war all the time, they have like a higher birth rate um thing like quite a lot. My suspicion about this is that like there are other countries that are on the brink of war, have recent memories of war, that know that they're in danger, like Taiwan, for example. Taiwan knows it's in danger and it hasn't responded with a high birth rate. Estonia, like they've got Russia like sniffing around their heels all the time. They don't have a particularly high birth rate. And like maybe there's like something different to the nature of Israeli war. But I always get suspicious of arguments that require like that kind of like quality of like the like something like that's so like unspecific that they rely on.
I think it is interesting to see in kind of the context of what you laid out about, countries who are generally more socially conservative tend to have lower birth rates than countries who are more socially liberal. But within the countries that are socially liberal, the communities that are more conservative tend to have higher birth rates. So I think there might be something to the argument that um, people who are socially conservative, socially liberal milieus do seem to have to uphold something that they maybe don't have to do in socially conservative milieus, where like the pressure for them to conform to liberalism or whatever, to kind of modern degeneracy, isn't as high. Like, there's something to protect, there's something to uphold. We know we need to contain our community, build it. So yeah, obviously very hard to test, but it is interesting that a lot of that there are kind of pressure factors that I don't know how people respond to this stuff, but do you see anything like that in the data?
Um, no, not really, or at least not that I can think of. There's one like interesting confounder to the more socially conservative people within countries have higher birth rates thing, which is that you might just be highlighting the fact that like rural housing costs are lower. And I don't know. I don't know if that's just what the data's picking up on. Because it is like region level, it's not individual level. Um, the idea that like more like Republican voting parts of the US have high birth rates. Instinctively, it seems obviously true that like more right-wing people are going to have more children, but I don't know if that's just because I spend a lot of time on the internet and actual like real right-wing people don't live like that at all. Like my experience of like sort of like regular like conservative voters in the UK is not that they are like living and breathing that some kind of like trad ideology, but that they actually seem like very, very similar to like Labour voters their age. So I don't
Mhm.
know.
Yeah, do you see a kind of especially kind of pernicious or like different impact on falling birth rates in the developing world compared to Europe? I mean, obviously, this is Europe's been the subject of Europe. We're thinking about this. It's all about elder care, but given that the developing world is and on the upswing, do you think that that's going to have an outsized impact, or how do you see that?
I actually think this is gonna be it's gonna be so bad. Like to have like an old population before you have a rich one seems, oh god, yeah, like just imagining it. I can't like fully picture what's going to happen, but it's going to be so bad because like countries like, let's take like India's a good example actually, where India is like just hit like a birth rate of 2. So they're currently like they're getting their demographic dividend. They like I really really hope that they're going to actualize that into like major economic growth so that they can like speed run um like the wealth that like the West has achieved, and like I think there are like some positive signs there. But if they don't manage that, um then you are just going to have like a lot of people who are like my age in India when they are old, who are going to be incredibly, incredibly poor in ways that like I can't really imagine because they're felt like hit by a double hit, which is that countries like Britain and America and Canada are going to keep like taking the brightest minds from these poorer countries. I'm sure like remittances like will help a bit, but they can only go so far if there are only like if our global population pyramid is inverted. Um, yeah, I think it's like a very, very worrying situation. Like like all of the kind of big issues that are heading down the track, like climate change, for example, they are going to hurt like the global poor like much worse than they're going to hurt people in rich countries, and I think that's very sad.
And how do you see the state of gender relations in India? I mean, I guess there's a lot of kind of upheaval. You hear a lot for all sorts of kind of sexual crimes and all this type of stuff. It's all over the
Mm.
internet. But I also see, and I've talked to a previous guest about kind of a growing kind of men's rights section. I mean, is it kind of a mirror image of the West, or is there kind of a special local flavor to how these conversations are happening?
I suspect there's a special local flavor, so I don't know tons about it, but like basically every country seems to be experiencing gender political polarization, which I suspect is the result of like instead of everyone having the same like media consumption diet, everyone's got like a personalized media consumption diet, and because of like average preference differences between the genders, you end up with people like bifurcating into like particular like clusters of like entertainment and messaging, which then like has like a run-on effect. Um, India, similar to East Asian countries, also has a skewed gender ratio because of like sex selection abortion, which means that men will be able to outvote women in these cases. And I think on top of that, India's got like an extra problem where because cousin marriage is quite common still in lots of communities, you end up with like domestic abuse. That's like it's going to take a couple of like steps to explain that. But because of cousin marriage, you end up with higher levels of domestic abuse. So like you see that like generally across the board, where like places where like kin marriage is higher because a woman like can't really leave her husband to go back to her family because it's the same family. You end up with like domestic abuse being like much more condoned usually within those cultures. So I think those like several sets of issues is yeah does mean that we probably do expect to see like much more like gender polarization between men and women in India than we would expect to see it in Western countries. I think there's like a kind of like level of inbuilt sexism that India has not been able to overcome. Yeah, like so my family's from South India, which is a particularly interesting version of this case. So Tamil Nadu is one of the like richest and most developed states, and also the state with the highest level of domestic violence, I believe. And like when I've gone to like visit my family, there is like this implicit sense that like I should not be allowed outside, like not without like serious chaperonage, because it's like quite dangerous for like single like women to be walking around. And I think I think that's really bad. I think it's really bad, and it doesn't seem to be turning around. And I suspect like um, this is especially because of the like aforementioned like skewed gender ratios, which mean there are like way more men per woman per woman. You end up with the same kind of effects that you see in polygynous societies where men have multiple wives, where you end up with a bunch of men who like cannot get a wife, which is historically abnormal because you would have expected there to be fewer men than women because of like violence and like war and stuff. And those men turn like much more violent than men with like wives and like girlfriends and stuff. So I can expect, yeah, I basically expect this to like gender ratios relations to be quite bad in India because of like gender ratios and cousin marriage. And yeah, that makes me pessimistic actually.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of the inevitable increased status of women. Even though I think labor force participation in India overall is still quite low, it's increasing, and yeah, inevitably it's going to lead to even more status differentials, and yeah, that seems to be one of the driving forces of the conflict in the West, and I can imagine in India
Mhm.
probably even more so.
Women are better at going to school. And this seems like, yeah, this seems to be kind of destabilizing for people.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a. I mean, obviously, you're not an India expert, but I've heard of some propositions, even by Western commentators, that maybe less schooling for women, less prioritization of women in schooling and all this type of stuff would be like a good thing for the birth rate in the long run. Yeah, I wonder how you know like you said, the polarization makes anything possible, but how soon we'll have this as a stated political agenda, outside of weird circles on the
Sorry,
internet.
I missed some of that because I think my internet gave out. Could you ask the question again, please?
Oh, no worries. No, I just wanted to see, because the idea that women should be deprioritized in schools and in employment is starting kind of to begin as a nucleus of an idea in
Mm.
chats and more the more fringe places online. But how do you think? Do you think we'll have a chance of seeing that on a list of priorities for major parties in Europe anytime soon?
Feel it feels so unrealistic to me. Yeah, it definitely feels like feminism is like baked in to like political culture like across the West now. I could be wrong. Like I wouldn't be surprised at all to see something like that in like East Asia. So like maybe I'm like being too like optimistic or chauvinistic or something to think that this feels like impossible at home. Um, Yeah, like I basically still see people celebrate the fact that like women are more likely to go to university. And until that changes, it seems like very unlikely there's going to be like a mainstream political move to say they should be deprioritized.
Yeah, no, I think the same, and it is interesting to me, like just generally the cause of pronatalism seems to be relegated to people who don't have that many children. I think, especially because child rearing really takes a lot of time. I mean, what do you make of the fact that probably most, if not, except maybe for the Collinses and their plans, but a lot of people who
Mm.
speak in the prenatal space are people who don't have children. They kind of aspire to a world where there are more children. But you think it's kind of a self-limiting thing? I mean, it has been for me because I've been speaking about this subject for a while. But yeah, it's a tough one. There was a prenatals conference that I was supposed to speak at, but I couldn't because I was having a baby. So I guess that's it tells you a real life
That's
example.
praxis. Um,
Exactly.
um, yeah, I guess I'm like reasonably forgiving of this for a couple of reasons. Like the first is that it's quite a young movement. Um, So and like it's quite like a young and like I guess like somewhat like elite or at least educated movement. So therefore like um even if pronatalists are like outperforming their peers in terms of birth rates, you still wouldn't expect them to have very many children yet. Like the average pronatalist I know is about 30 and probably has like one child. Um that I mean in Britain that is like over outperforming their peers, I think. Um Although like only just maybe that's just average, never mind. Yeah, so I guess there's that. I also think it is like totally legitimate to support politics while thinking it's like difficult to live those ideals in practice. So like I think it is like totally legitimate to be like an aristocratic student in the French Revolution who thinks that we should behead aristocrats, for example. I think it's like totally legitimate to be a champagne socialist and to say that like actually like I think like the world should be in this different way. And I like from my like own experiences. So like I like one example. This isn't my own opinion, but I think it'd be like totally legitimate to be like I don't want to have children. I think modern Britain makes it like far too difficult to have children. This is a critical problem, and the country needs to change this. I think that's a totally legitimate like opinion to hold. And if I were poorer, I think it would be like basically an opinion I would have to hold because of the ways in which modern Britain makes it so difficult to have children. Um, so yeah, I do think it's like totally legitimate to have a pro-natalist movement made up of people with not many children, partly because of demographic factors, like of the people who are in the movement, but also partly because I think it's like totally legitimate to have like a political philosophy that you're not living.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, to be honest, a lot of political commentary, especially people with Roman statue avatars and things like that. I think it's going to be hard for them to return to the Bronze Age. So yeah, I think it's been a wonderful conversation. But I have to ask you the last question. This question of the show: do you have a recommended thinker that you think is a bit underrated, people should check out?
Yeah, no. So you sent me the question earlier, and I had like a little think about it. And everyone I can think of, I think is like actually quite rated. Like I'm like, who are the thinkers that I think are great? And I think like, I'm thinking your Scott Alexander's, you're yeah. So I'm gonna do something cheeky. I'm gonna say one of my friends,
Hmm.
who I think is a like underrated writer. Her name's Ellen Pasternak, and she wrote a piece for Works in Progress, which I think is like a very nice framing of an idea, which is about how motherhood, like parenting in general, is a public good, but we treat it like it's a private contribution. So that is my
No,
that is my like underrated thinker. I think this is like a nice packaging of an idea that people intuitively hold, but she is the first person I've seen like elucidate it that way.
perfect. No, that sounds like a good essay. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the show notes. I think it's really fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Aria. Where can people find you? What should they read? Where can they check you out?
You can find me at ariababu.co.uk, which is my Substack. Basically, that's where I am. I'm also on Twitter under my name. I'm the only person in the world with my name, so I'm actually very easy to Google.
Wonderful. You're one of the other ones. I am also the only person in the world with my name. My last
I've
name
got
is limited to just my family.
yeah, we've got great SEO.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know what my two other cousins make of the fact that I've been, populating Google with only my stuff, but whatever. They have to make peace with it. Thank you so much, Arya. This was lovely. Yeah, I hope we can do this again. And I hope you continue writing on the subject and others. Yeah, I'll put the Substack in the show notes and people should really read your writing because I think it's very insightful and very based on the data, which is always a plus because people like to riff on this stuff, but it's always important to look at what is actually knowable. So thank you so much, Aria.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll see you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, I urge you to like it, to subscribe, to comment on it. But also, if you'd like to support me in a more expansive and generous way, please do go to alexkashuta.com, which is my Substack, or to patreon.com/aksubversive, where you can find the backlog of everything I've ever recorded, articles, and everything that's related to the Subversive / Alex Kashuta family. Thank you so much for helping, for supporting me, and for keeping the lights on.